What's up, folks? Welcome back to Tactical Tortoise. My name is Trevi, and recently we've gotten a ton of new news about updates to the Grand Tournament Warhammer 40,000 mission pack. Let's talk about them. Now, this news is going to be amalgamated from a couple different sources, not the least of which being the US Open 2021 finals coverage, in which Warhammer community unveiled a lot of the changes upcoming. Some of the show matches that were played used some rules, and the commentators discussed some of the changed rules over the course of the event. On top of that, the popular wargaming blog Goonhammer had coverage of all of the new secondary objectives that were used during the course of those show matches. I'm going to drop a link to their article down below the video so you can go check them out yourself, but that is what we're going to be covering today. Now, to start with, let's jump over to Warhammer Community, where in preparation for this finals coverage, they talked about two of the new missions that are coming out in the new GT packet. These being Secure Missing Artifacts and Recover the Relics. Now, in these missions and the commentary around them, we see some of the core changes that are going to be coming to the new mission structure. In the 2020 and 2021 format for 9th edition Warhammer 40k, primary objectives are scored in increments of 5 points, a maximum of 15 per round, for a total of 45 over the course of the battle. Primary objective points that are scored in your command phase at the start of your turn for holding 1 or more objective markers, 2 or more objective markers, or instead 2 objective markers or 3 objective markers in some missions that use the domination progressive objective, and then also controlling more objective markers than your opponent's controls, all scored you those increments of 5. However, those are going to be changing to score you 4 points apiece. While both of the missions that we saw previewed on Warhammer Community use the take and hold progressive objective scoring, means that you score for 1 or 2 objective markers rather than 2 or 3 objective markers, it's been made clear so far that domination style secondaries are still going to be in the rotation. So those hold 2 to score 5 or 3 for 10 are still going to be around. Now, I talked about some of my most and least favorite missions in the current GT format, and those domination missions tended to score relatively low. They tend to be very swingy and difficult to get points on reliably, which often makes them snowball. So once one player is able to get an attrition lead or start contesting objectives, they force the opponent down to having so little primary points that it's very difficult for them to claw back into the game. Unfortunately, it doesn't look like in the update to the system those are going to be going away. Now, all of these requirements have changed from scoring 5 points in the GT 2021 package to scoring 4 points. However, every mission in place of a mission-specific secondary objective that you could take in any of your secondary objective slots, each mission is now going to be getting a second progressive objective that's going to score an additional 3 points per battle round for a potential total of 15. Now, this does a couple things. Obviously, you're still at a maximum of 45 points over the course of the game, but you don't necessarily have to score those 45 points all in one turn, which means you could come into a situation where you have a tough time getting that special progressive objective, or on the flip side, you have a tough time scoring your normal primary objectives for holding points, and you can kind of make up some of those points by scoring these 3 victory points for the I guess we'll call them the sub-primary objective, the second primary objective. I don't know. We'll come up with a cool name for them. The mission-specific criterion. So if we take a look at Secure Missing Artifacts here, the first mission that was previewed in Warhammer Community, this is very clearly a reskin of priority targets from the GT 2020 and GT 2021 mission pack. We have still these priority target objective moving mechanics. The objectives are placed in the same place, and if we take a very quick peek at the other one that was previewed, Recover the Relics, it's actually just retrieval mission with a new skin. So as we can see, the position of the objectives is unlikely to change going into this new 2022 format. That said, these new progressive objectives absolutely change the paradigm quite a bit. In this case, the priority target's secondary is essentially built now into the primary. Priority targets in the previous version of the mission scored you 3 victory points at the end of each of your turns if you held one of the objectives that you picked to be your priority target objective. Because the objectives moved, you would typically pick one of your objectives in your side of the table, moved it into an advantageous position, declared it as your target for the priority target secondary, and got an easy 15 points on that secondary. They're nipping that in the bud here. This used to be the most highest scoring mission, and one that was pretty easy, especially if you didn't have great secondary picks, because you were almost guaranteed a 15-pointer on that mission-specific secondary. secondary, but now you're going to have to pick other secondaries normally. The other difference here is that your priority targets selection is now chosen by your opponent, which means your opponent's going to try to move an objective into a disadvantageous position and then select that as the objective that you're going to be having to go for in order to score your primary objective points. So in addition to your secondary objective selections being a little bit more difficult because you don't have that super easy one in there and basically only 2 secondary objective slots that you then have to pick to fill, your primary objective scoring is going to be a little bit tougher since you can no longer just hole up on your priority target objective. You're gonna have to probably move a little bit more aggressively forward. Now, given that you're gonna have some control over the position of those objectives, at least one of those objectives is gonna shift. This does still make this probably one of the most defensive missions in the packet, but it is not quite as consistent as the previous version. A paradigm that I imagine we're gonna see is players electing to move their no man's land objective over electing to move the objective in their deployment zone. This is going to allow you to move it backwards, closer to your lines, and because the other objective is already in your deployment zone, the likelihood is that it's going to be in or around terrain already, and be in the safest position for the remainder of your army, given that it's going to be much farther away from your opponent. That means that even if your opponent gets the opportunity to move the objective in your deployment zone, they can shuffle it a couple inches forward, which makes it easier for them to contest, but it's still the easiest objective for you to score. This makes the decision for your opponent of which of those 2 objectives to select as their priority target's objective that you're going to have to hold at the end of your turn to score those primary objective points pretty difficult, since the objective that's already clearly better for them is going to be moved closer to your lines, and the objective that they are going to get to move is the one that already starts far away from them. Depending on the terrain setup, this could change, obviously, but I think it kind of compounds the issue that priority targets has with the objective moving mechanic, where we see basically this objective shift in the same way almost every time the mission is played. That said, it does add a little bit of an additional strategy to the pregame of this mission, and I've always liked these moving objectives. I think adding that a little bit of extra flexibility and a little bit of extra strategery has always been nice for the mission. Now, moving on to the second mission that we had spoiled, this is Recover the Relics, basically a retrieval mission clone from the GT 2021 format. This has 2 short table edge deployment zones with 1 objective inside and 2 objectives basically right on the edge of those deployment zones. It also has a relatively easy primary objective with the ability to score 4 points for holding 1 objective or 8 for holding 2, which means that you can very comfortably get 8 points on your primary every turn by castling in your deployment zone, setting up banners, and playing a lot of defensive secondaries like that. The mission has been changed significantly, however, to be much more aggressive. Previously, it was, I think, the #1 most defensive mission in the packet. You had even objectives on both sides, meaning that in order to score a 15-point turn or knock your opponent down to a 10-point turn, you had to take several objectives that were on the opposite side of the table, and the rush distance between the 2 players' armies was typically very long, which means that defensive armies had much more opportunity to attack an aggressive army that was trying to get into them. It also made secondary objectives like Raise the Banners High or Stubborn Defiance very powerful because it was difficult for your opponent to get to the back of your table to start knocking down those banners or unlocking those Stubborn Defiance objectives. The design team has really tried to push this mission in the opposite direction. There are some very punishing special rules, and the second progressive objective for the primary definitely supports aggressive play. In this case, you do not receive your command phase Battleforge CP bonus, the free CP that you get at the start of the turn, if you don't control any of the objectives that are on your opponent's side of the table. This is very punishing. The Battleforge CP bonus obviously is a backbone of the CP economy, and not getting that CP bonus, especially for armies that have to spend a lot of CP pregame, is going to be absolutely brutal. This means that generally on turn 1, you are not going to be getting that CP bonus in almost any circumstances, unless you have some pregame movement abilities. One thing to keep in mind is that most forward deploy abilities still require you to stay outside of 9 inches of your opponent's deployment zone. And given the position of these objectives, the outermost edge of that objective control zone for each objective is actually going to be slightly inside 9 inches of their deployment zone. So you will need the ability to either chain together multiple pre-game movement abilities. Something like Raven Guard can do this, where they can have a forward deploy unit with Master of Ambush, and then use a pre-game move ability to jump on that objective, as long as there aren't any other enemy forward deployers there stopping them. So outside of those very specific circumstances, you are not going to be scoring that Battle Force CP on turn 1. And for the most part, I think most of those abilities will require you to spend CP anyway, so you're going to be spending CP to gain CP, so it doesn't actually do that much for you. So not only does this require you to get across the table if you want to be running your army efficiently from a CP standpoint, but on top of that, the second progressive objective for the primary objective basically gives you points for kills. It's just like straight up annihilation from back in the day. At the end of each battle round, you score a victory point for each enemy unit that was destroyed. Okay, full stop. That's it. It's up to a maximum of 3 victory points per round, as is normal for all of these progressive primary objective abilities. Now, the way to get big points on this, obviously, is to get very aggro and into your opponent's face and start killing their units quickly. But I do think that it also gives you a way to play a little bit defensively, as is the theme of the mission, and continue to maintain parity on primary objectives. If your opponent's running at you and you're able to hide the majority of your army and take potshots at them and slowly kill them, as they're moving up the table to grab objectives and their secondaries, you can be scoring points for destroying them. Destroying entire units, especially with the requirement of destroying 9-ish entire units in order to score this primary out fully, is kind of a tall order. Unless your opponent has a lot of individual utility units, it's very difficult to wipe out a ton of units very quickly, especially in the early game. So it'll be interesting to see how high this mission ends up scoring. A retrieval mission classically is a very high scoring mission, since both players can basically be guaranteed 10 points on primary objectives. However, with the requirement that you start killing people, that number might start decreasing. I'm really interested to see how this paradigm shift changes how these missions play, especially this kill mission, and if there are more primary objective sections like this elsewhere in the document. I think we may see some lists start trying to shave down their potential utility units and bulk up on more horde-style units, large numbers of big units, rather than taking a billion individual dedicated transports or smaller 1- or 2-man units to perform actions. Now, speaking of actions, let's talk about some secondary objectives, because the secondary objectives have gotten some big overhauls. Now, some of these were discussed during the show matches from the US Open Finals, and all of them were covered in the Goonhammer article that I mentioned earlier. I'll just go down the line here of all of the secondary objectives that have changed and talk about my thoughts on how they may change the use case of that secondary going on into the 2022 format. First off, no prisoners. This one scores you on a tally for every wounds worth of typically infantry, but it's non-monster, non-vehicle, non-character units that you kill. The Goonhammer artist specifically mentions non-vehicle, non-character. I assume non-monster is still included in there. If not, that may change dramatically how this secondary gets taken. But for each 10 points on your tally, you'll get 1 victory point. The change is that if you've killed 50 plus wounds worth of models, you'll get an additional victory point for free, and if you killed 100 wounds worth, you'll get an additional 2 victory points for free instead. This is a significant buff to the power level of this secondary. It's already one of the most powerful secondaries in the game. If you are up against an opponent that has, let's say, 130, 140 wounds worth of infantry that you're going to be able to kill, and you are probably going to be killing a lot of them because that many wounds of infantry tends to be relatively flimsy, it allows you to continually score victory points over the course of the game while just enacting your normal game plan. Games of Warhammer 40k are incredibly bloody, and you're oftentimes trading units to knock your opponent off objectives or score objectives yourself, and no prisoners allow your opponent to essentially also benefit from those units trading their lives. I don't love this secondary. I think that the armies with large numbers, especially of multi-wound models, don't tend to be particularly strong, and no prisoners tends to punish them harshly, so I don't love that this has been changed. Engage in All Fronts saw an enormous change. This is one of the most commonly taken secondaries in the game. Previously, it scored you 2 points if you had units wholly within 3 table quarters of the board, and 3 points if you are wholly within every table quarter of the board, still outside 6 inches of the center of the table. The change is now, in order to count, you must be a vehicle or monster, or you must have 3 models in your unit. This means that deep striking individual models or running individual very cheap units up to the table to grab that engaged in all fronts no longer counts. Things like Cyber Wolves and Lictors were extremely popular for this. They would just be able to run up, get the engaged in all fronts, and all you'd have to do is hold the 2 cable quarters that are in your deployment zone or near your deployment zone, and then have 1 model run out to grab those 2 points, which made it a very consistent secondary. No longer. Now you actually have to be able to contribute some volume of model count in order to actually score that secondary. It also means that you're no longer getting free points if like 1 or 2 dregs of an infantry unit survive in your opponent's table quarter, which was something that happened relatively often. If your opponent maybe spiked low on an attack roll, weren't able to wipe out a unit that was performing an action or contesting objective and left 1 or 2 models there, that would often just give you a 1 or 2 point bump on engage on all fronts without really having to contribute the rest of your army. Again, it's going to have to either be a monster or vehicle, or you'd have to leave 3 models alive, which is a lot more difficult. Bring It Down had a change to make it more in line with its previous versions. Bring It Down is a secondary that scores you on the number of monsters or vehicles that you have killed at the end of the game. In the initial version of the GT pack back in 2020, it was extremely punishing, with every monster or vehicle model that you killed worth at least 2 points, depending on its wounds count. That was changed to be only 1 point for vehicles that were 10 or less wounds. A lot of vehicles that happened to be at that 10 wound threshold ended up being very popular. Drukhari Raiders and Archaeopters are 2 very prevalent examples that we saw absolutely dominate the metagame and not get punished by that Bring It Down that was meant to punish lists that were spamming a particular type of vehicle. The wounds counts have been adjusted, with that 1 VP score reserved for models with 9 or fewer wounds, and models with 10 to 14 wounds being worth 2 VP. Models with 15 plus wounds now give you the full 3 VP for each one that's destroyed, rather than the previous requirement, which was 20 plus wounds, which was almost no vehicles or monsters that were commonly taken in the game. With units like kill rigs becoming a lot more popular and there being a lot more of these big beefy vehicle models seeing the table, that 15 plus wound bracket may be very prevalent now. And especially with Drukhari lists that are focusing on monsters like Talos and Kronos in very large numbers, the age of Drukhari Raider spam is mostly over, but this change can still hit them if they're taking a high number of Raiders, although with the recent points changes to that faction, it's probably unlikely. So the number of times that these changes are going to make a huge difference is not great, but it is still an appreciated change, although one that probably comes a little bit late. Deploy Teleport Homers saw a big change. Previously, this is an action secondary that required you to perform it in your opponent's deployment zone. That was later changed in GT 2021 to score you a lesser number of VPs if it was completed wholly within 12 inches of your opponent's deployment zone. The downside is that it's a full round action scoring at the start of your next turn, meaning that you not only have to get a unit into your opponent's deployment zone, they also have to survive. The difference now is that this secondary completes automatically at the end of your turn if you're performing it with a troops option. This makes troops, infantry, and bikers that have access to a deep strike, I'm looking directly at factions like Genestealer cults, extremely good at this secondary, especially if you're in a situation where your opponent is not going to be able to fully screen out their deployment zone over the course of the game. If their list is very aggressive or low model count, that could make them have to play very suboptimally in order to stop you from deploying those teleport homers, in which case you can still perform the action for the lesser reward of 2 victory points if you're wholly within 12 inches of their zone. This is going to be a very big change, not one that every faction is going to see the benefit of, but again, anyone with cheap troops infantry that have access to that automatic deep strike is going to be absolutely loving this. Retrieve Octarius data, the evolution of deploy scramblers from GT 2020, has been superseded yet again by now Retrieve Nachtmund data. I don't know why we can't just settle on a name for this secondary and keep it that way. I liked Deploy Scramblers. I think it worked just fine. But now we're retrieving all sorts of different datum. Retrieve Octarius data was an action secondary that took only 1 turn to complete, starting at the end of your command phase and completing at the end of your turn, and would score you points at the end of the game for the number of table quarters you were able to complete it in. Your units would have to be 6 inches away from the dividing line between the table quarters, meaning that there was essentially a 12-inch band through the center of the table, both long and short ways that you could not perform the action in. But if you were able to get into those far-reaching corners of the table and complete the action several times, you would score 4 victory points for completing it at least twice, 8 victory points for completing it 3 times, and 12 victory points for completing it all 4 in separate table quarters each time. This made it an absolute no-brainer for a lot of factions that had access to very cheap, very small, or particularly fast infantry that could run out and perform the actions. Again, factions like Genestealer Cult use this secondary quite a bit, but also units like Swooping Hawks and Tyrannid Lictors, as well as units coming out of Strategic Reserve, sometimes even units like Cryptothralls or Space Marine Scouts, either dropping out of their outflank or out of a transport, we're going to be able to complete this relatively consistently. However, this change introduces a big downside. There is a little bit of an upside, which that it is now able to be completed by a biker unit, and being a secondary that requires you to move pretty far, that biker unit key is a big deal. They're actually going to be able to drop into those table quarters pretty quickly without having to resort to something like deep striking, meaning that your retrieve Nachtmun data is going to be relatively unscreenable. It also removes the character restriction from the secondary. Previously, Retrieve Octarius data could not be completed by character models, but now it can. However, again, big huge downside here. You got to roll a die in order to complete the action. It's based on a random number. The number you have to roll in order for that unit to successfully complete the action is equal to or less than the number of models in your unit. You get an additional bonus to this if you are a troops option, not necessarily objective secured, just troops, at least according to the article, which subtracts one from their die roll, which means that, for example, a 5-man intercessor squad is going to be able to complete it automatically, given that even if they roll a 6, with that -1 bonus, they're going to be hitting a 5, which is equal to the number of models in their unit, and they will complete the action. This makes it much worse for units that have been depleted over the course of the game, or units that start smaller with 1, 2, or 3 individual models. That makes it very unlikely for those units to be able to complete the action, and you're probably not going to be taking a secondary that there's a significant chance you'll just fail and not be able to attempt the action again. Again, that character restriction being pulled off doesn't matter so much since most character units are only single models, and you're only going to be able to complete the action on a roll of a 1. Now, while this makes this style of secondary, previously Retrieve Octarius data, now Retrieve Nachtmun data, much less reliable, it's also problematic that it hits a lot of factions very differently. Some factions won't even notice a change or will simply change the number of models in their Retrieve Octarius data units to be slightly more so that they have a better chance of getting that action off. But some factions without access to those tools are just left out in the cold. I'm very sad for my very pretty lictors, but unfortunately, not being able to complete the secondary means that those guys probably aren't seeing play in the future. Investigate Signal has seen a change. Previously, it's an action that allows an infantry unit wholly within 6 inches of the center of the battlefield, while no enemy units were wholly within 6 inches of the center of the battlefield, to score 3 points if they were able to complete the action. Fortunately, it's a 1-turn action, meaning it started at the end of your movement phase and completes at the end of your turn, meaning your opponent has very little say in whether or not it's completed. There was actually a little bit of controversy with this secondary in the past. In a preview article, the Games Workshop team had actually told us that this secondary was more difficult to contest. However, that change was never made in GT 2021, and the secondary remained almost entirely unplayed. Now, you can investigate signals if there are enemy units within 6 inches of the center of the battlefield. However, the action only completes and you only score your 3 victory points if they're dead by the end of the turn. This actually makes it a much more interesting secondary to choose. Whereas instead of grabbing something like Retrieve Octarius data, you could be taking your Investigate Signal, assume that you're going to be shooting everyone in the center of the table to death, and running one of your small utility units to wholly within the center of the table in order to grab those 3 points. It's significantly less efficient than other action secondaries, and on top of that, doesn't synergize well with secondaries like Engage in All Fronts, which you specifically do not score if you're within 6 inches of the center of the table, but is definitely an option for factions looking to pick up an action-specific secondary that they can complete relatively easily. Moving on to the Warcraft secondaries, unfortunately these still exist. I personally don't like the entire tree of Warcraft. I don't like that it gives factions with access to Psychers some additional options, and I also don't like that it gives factions without access to Psychers a good way to deal with Psychers that doesn't really change their game plan. Feels very focused on punishing a small number of factions, and I don't think it's particularly fair. The one change here that's important to note is that Psychic Interrogation has been changed, thank the lords, to no longer require line of sight. Previously, Mental Interrogation, which was a psychic action performed while within 18 inches of an enemy character that was successfully completed on a 4, it was changed in GT 2021 to require a 12-inch range, but only be able to target visible enemy characters. On a completed action, you scored 3 points, so when you could target non-visible characters, it allowed you to very passively farm 3 victory points every turn if your opponent had any characters that were playing relatively aggressively. Now, with a 24-inch range, and being able to complete the action out of line of sight, meaning your opponent is unable to hide from your Psychers, they will either need to take some psychic defense or play hyper defensive with those characters in order to stop you from psychically interrogating them. The previous change took a somewhat flex pick secondary into the realm of almost unplayability, since the requirement to just hide your character out of line of sight wasn't all that big of a deal, especially with the prevalence of obscuring terrain or true line of sight blocking terrain around the center of the table where aggressive characters could hide. With those characters typically having fly or being infantry, they could sit behind a ruin for a couple turns and then jump out the one turn that they need to, meaning that they've already blocked you 6 or 8 points from your mental interrogations. Now that you can continue to farm off those characters, that makes this secondary very good, and the extended range, I think, is a very big deal. Unfortunately, we haven't seen any other changes to any of the other secondaries in this tree. Not even Abhor the Witch or Pierce the Veil. Pierce the Veil being one of the most inexplicably terrible secondaries ever to be written. So that's all of the changes that we know so far of for the GT 2022 mission packet. Overall, it promises to be the paradigm shift from the GT 2020 and GT 2021 packet that we were hoping from the GT 2021 release. That release ended up flopping entirely. We saw no mission changes, only some very subtle changes to secondaries, and I think exactly one list building change, which meant that the new format was essentially the old one with your deploy scramblers crossed out and replaced with the retrieve Octarius data. In addition to now replacing that retrieve Octarius data with this new retrieve Nachmund data, we're also going to see these fundamental changes to how primary objectives are scored and how missions are going to be played out. I'm excited to see what we see in the final version of this format. I think it's going to be transformative to how the game's played, and I'm definitely excited to see how list building is going to change to compensate. As a Tyranid player, I am a little bit upset that most of the ways I've scored points throughout the edition so far have been entirely removed. Secondary objectives are going to be absolutely brutal for armies, especially without faction-specific secondaries, or at least without good faction-specific secondaries, because a lot of the easier, if lower scoring secondaries have been removed, meaning that your game plan is going to be a lot less consistent. That said, 40k players are nothing if not creative, and I think some strategies are going to arise from this new gamut of secondaries that are going to be very interesting, and I'm here for it. Anyway, that's all for today, folks. Thanks for watching all the way to the end of the video. Big thanks to everyone who supports Tactical Tortoise over on Patreon at patreon.com/tacticaltortoise. Also, YouTube channel members, Twitch subscribers. I've actually been streaming almost every day on Twitch, grinding a lot of games for an upcoming GT with Tyranid. So if you want to see some ridiculous Tyranid gameplay, you can go over there, twitch.tv/tacticaltortoisetv, and check me out. It's a good time. Anyway, thanks again for watching. Remember to keep it classy, folks, and have happy wargaming.